Hi constant readers, my name is Emily, welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about The Wind Through the Keyhole by Stephen King, which, in terms of publication order, was chronologically after the Dark Tower series, published in 2012. The Dark Tower was published in 2004. Within the series, it's chronologically after Wizard and Glass. I'm just gonna go through my notes, the things that I wrote down, the things that interested me, and just sort of chat about them. I don't have any sort of analysis or anything planned. That is coming later. So the first thing, page 16 of The Wind Through the Keyhole, we learn that The Wind Through the Keyhole is the name of a story from Magic Tales of the Eld. So it's a fairy tale. This is a book named after a fictional fairy tale. And if you've followed along with the series, you know that I see that the Dark Tower series is very much rooted in a fairy tale past, and fairy tales are sort of a branch of fantasy literature. It gets woven in and out depending on where you are in terms of the history of literature, so that this book is like really anchoring itself in fairy tale is super cool, and I was very excited about it. In the narrative of the Dark Tower series, this is sort of a branch-off adventure in which Roland and his cadet, on their journey to the Dark Tower, have to stop and take shelter from a storm. While they are killing time waiting out this storm, Roland tells a story about his youth. So Roland is telling his cadet and us about this time as a young gunslinger when he went out into the land to problem solve because this big bad was damaging people in a village, in a small community. To protect this young boy who has witnessed this big bad, Roland and this boy are sitting in a jail cell together, and to comfort this boy, Roland tells this boy a fairy tale. And that is the story of The Wind Through the Keyhole. So we are reading a story about Roland telling a story about the time that he told a story. I love that it gets so meta. That was fantastic. And I love the idea of, quote, "a person is never too old for stories," end quote. And that's on page 131 in my edition of this text. So Roland says, "Storytelling, quote, was a thing I learned to do well in time. I had to. All gunslingers have to," end quote, also on page 131. So the idea that these sort of cowboy knights are storytellers, that they are like the linking in some way of these hero figures with storytelling and I guess the quest to tell a story, and that it's something that you have to do, like all gunslingers have to be able to tell stories, I think is interesting. I don't really know what to make of that, but I think it's interesting to note, and I wrote it down. The story that I think interested me the most, that I took the most notes on, was The Wind Through the Keyhole, which is a fairy tale. From like its very construction, we have a dead father and an evil stepfather. I love that elements from the gunslinger story, so elements that within the Dark Tower narrative would be considered real, like the Covenant Man, who is the Man in Black, like that our Man in Black is a character in a fairy tale, is interesting because it suggests that there's some truth within all fairy tales. Like, you look at something like Little Red Riding Hood that seems so fantastical. There aren't talking wolves that dress up like grannies and eat young girls. But if you think about it as a metaphor for young women being preyed upon by men and protecting their virtue, because like that red cloak is an indication of menstruation, it's a sign of womanhood, so having a man prey on you, like staying on the path and not talking to strangers, then becomes a warning to like stay on the straight and narrow, good Christian path, protect your virtue, don't engage with wolves, like don't engage with predators who are going to want to remove you from this path and consume you and destroy your virtue, right? So like there's some truth in all fairy tales. There's something at the core that is real. And so the idea that like the Covenant Man, the Man in Black, is this fairy tale villain that we're interacting with in The Gunslinger as like a real character, I thought was really neat. And you have that line between fiction and reality blurred once again, and I love when the series does that. I also love that Tim, who is the character in the Wind Through the Keyhole, the abused child of the stepfather, on page 175 mentions that, quote, like the Red King in an old story, the Covenant man would ride away with him. The Red King is a real person in the narrative of the Dark Tower series, but is also a character in a fairy tale, like a figure, like a spooky figure to be feared. Again, you have that blurring of what is real. Also on page 192, I loved the idea of the Covenant man's magic wand being the gear shift from a car. As an American fantasy series, The Dark Tower includes elements that are very American in my opinion, and the idea that you have this dodge gear shift as a magic wand, that an American-made technology is like magic or makes magic, I think very much fits with the sort of stereotypical American narrative that we see throughout American literature. It's the idea of the American dream, that you can have it all, you can participate in systems like the capitalist, industrial, mechanized system of building cars and make money and rise out of poverty and get the house with the picket fence and the wife. But then that idea is challenged itself within the fairy tale when we see that Tim Ross's stepfather was somebody who wanted that American dream. He wanted to have it all, and he experiences such disillusionment when he cannot have the wife that he wants, the life that he wants, so he kills his best friend and he takes it, and how dark and twisted that becomes when he takes that ideal dream life that he wants. I just thought that was really interesting. I liked the idea of Tim having to journey to Merlin's house, which is deep in the woods, very much like Hansel and Gretel, heading into this dark, untamed place. Forests are really interesting in fairy tales. I'm doing some research right now on the forest as a figure in fairy tales, and it's absolutely fascinating. I love the idea of this like naive character moving into this wild and untamed dark space. I love the rooting in fantasy and fairy tales there too, with the Hansel and Gretel connection. Well, a lot of fairy tales actually go into the forest, don't they? I love also how on page 238 we learn that the Covenant man's truths, quote, worked in two ways, end quote. The idea of duality in truths, that there are always two sides to this truth coin, shall we say. On page 242, Tim leaves the path like Little Red Riding Hood. In fairy tales, leaving the path is disobedience. It's dangerous to leave the path. In terms of biblical narratives, which is a sort of, depending on what you believe, a mythology, a sort of fairy tale as well. Like, whether or not you believe the Bible literally, they are very much oral stories in the same way that fairy tales are. They are passing on a message through a story. And so in the Bible, when somebody strays from the path, it's straying from rightness, straying from righteousness, straying from a God-fearing living. In the Dark Tower series, straying from the path means leaving the beam. And I love that idea of all three of these sort of folk and fairy tales, mythology, the idea of leaving the beam and the consequences, leaving the path and the consequences of that. I love the sort of drawing together of all of that, especially because this is American fantasy, and Americanness seems to be very closely tied to Christianity. And so that all of that sort of gets wrapped up in there. I think it's excellent. Then on page 278, we know that Tim is on the path of the beam again, guided by a technological fairy godmother, Daria. Those fairy tale connections, very strong. I love it. On page 296, we learn that the guardian of the beam at this end is Aslan, which is of course a reference to Narnia, like your classic portal fantasy, which the Dark Tower series definitely plays with. It brought up questions for me, again, about the ties of this series to Christianity, being an American fantasy novel, the idea that Aslan within the Narnia series is a allegory for the Christian God figure. What does that do? Like, what does it mean that a Christian God supports the beam, supports this path? Like, how do you make sense of that? I really like the idea on page 309 of, quote, "Time is a keyhole. We sometimes bend and peer through it, and the wind we feel on our cheeks when we do, the wind that blows through the keyhole, is the breath of all the living universe," end quote. I love the idea of like the image of a keyhole being a small window into something larger. I don't fully know what to do with this. I love that imagery. It's something I'm still mulling over. Then, of course, on page 321, we have, quote, "Think of home," end quote, which is a reference to The Wizard of Oz, which is, of course, an American fairy tale. Like, The Wizard of Oz is Baum's attempt at an American fairy tale. It very much, I've talked about this before earlier in the Dark Tower series. I will try and link that above and below as well if you're interested to hear me talk about The Wizard of Oz and its connection to Americanness in the Dark Tower series. But I love the idea of it referencing the movie, quote, "For as someone or other famous once said, there's no place like home," end quote. Really rooting itself in the Americanness of the fantasy of this fairy tale. It's one of the reasons that The Wind Through the Keyhole is probably one of my favorite books in the Dark Tower series, and I will be ranking the books in a future episode. And I love how Roland concludes this tale within a tale with, quote, "And so it happened once upon a by, long before your grandfather's grandfather was born," end quote. And that's on 337. That whole fairy tale ending is perfect. I love it. It brought me so much joy. After Roland concludes telling this fairy tale to the young boy, there's something evil in the mine. Roland sort of solves that. He learns about his mother, and then he comes out of that story. Then we're back in the Dark Tower narrative with Roland and his cadet, and like once again, that story comes to an end for us. I just loved it. I loved all of the layers to this. I'm also at this point curious what it's like to read this chronologically. Next time when I reread the Dark Tower series, I will be placing this as a 4.5. I think it might be interesting to experience it after Wizard and Glass, which is a massive book. A huge chunk of that book already takes place in Roland's past. So then to read this, which like super diverts from the larger Dark Tower narrative and just, it's like a little dessert. It's like a little cookie, it's a treat, it's a handout for fans of the series to just soak up more goodness of the series. I'm curious what it does to the pacing of reading the series to take a break from like the larger, ever-increasing pace of the series, because I found the series really picked up pace as it went along, which makes sense because if the whole series is a gyre spiraling out towards this point of chaos, it makes sense that the narrative of the series picks up in pace as well. I'm just curious what popping this in the middle of that does to the experience of that ever-increasing pace. Those are my thoughts on The Wind Through the Keyhole by Stephen King. Let me know your thoughts on The Wind Through the Keyhole in the comments down below. If you liked what you saw here today, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing. Before we go, we have to thank my patrons. Thank you, patrons, for making videos like this and other projects possible. I really appreciate the work that you are enabling me to do. So that really concludes this video for today. I will see you next week with a overall wrap up on the experience of reading the whole series, and I will also rank the books from 1 to 8 in terms of my favorite to least favorite in the series. Stay tuned for that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye!